Hello, how are you? Welcome to Telesur's Critical Move. While neoliberal governments concentrate the majority of their resources in protecting their economies and implementing weak policies to shield their peoples against the current COVID-19 pandemic, other nations, the progressive ones, put the human being at the center of their attention, not only inside their countries, but also beyond their borders. We are reflecting today about international solidarity. Let's deploy the board. We are making the first move. Let's listen first to statements by authorities and social sectors regarding solidarity. I believe that Cuba's greatest strength lies in its national health system. In the structure of its national health system is professional workforce with almost 500,000 people dedicated to public health care. It's a public, universal and free system with the people having absolute access through a primary health care network featuring the community physician and nurse. We're prepared for altruism, internationalism, and human solidarity. We are also ready to, once again, step forward the same way others did when they volunteered to fight for Ebola and save human lives. We are doing it as always do, with hearts and our know-how. These people who are exposing themselves to coronavirus do deserve this applause, and at least the Cubans do. Even though I'm 85 years old, I'm still fighting for Cuba, our homeland, for our people, so they continue on and defeat the virus is affecting us. We are supporting the people of the United Kingdom with the supplies they requested, including ventilators, personal protection gear, goggles, test kits, and other medical supplies. China and the UK are two countries commanding global influence. I think China and the UK can take initiatives to promote international cooperation. It's also important in this time of crisis to establish green corridors free of trade wars and sanctions that would ensure joint supplies of medication, food, equipment, and technology. We should introduce a joint moratorium on restrictions on essential goods as well as on financial transactions for their purchase. It's a question of life and death. It's a purely humanitarian issue. These matters should be freed of any politics. And in Solidarity Key we are speaking today. Today we're going to start with Twitter about Cuba. For instance, the Minister of Public Health, MINSAP, on May 31st tweeted, Cuba trained its own human resource sources in medical science depending on the needs of its national health system. This has allowed the country to face the current situation with a significant number of doctors, nurses, technicians, and other healthcare professionals. Let's see the other video. In this same context, we're going to see another user, Diego Cubanito, May 30th. Tonight in Cuba, hundreds of Cubans go to their balconies to applaud for life to show, that's the hashtag, to show appreciation for our doctors, nurses, and healthcare technicians who have brought love and solidarity to dozens of countries in the world. Cuba saved lives. Here it is. With that applause, we're going to listen. Last, we're going to see the tweet by Cuban ambassador in Andorra. He was tweeting, Cuba's national anthem is heard on the streets of Old Town of Andorra's capital as a token of appreciation by one of its residents for the contribution of the Cuban Medical Brigade in the battle against COVID-19. Cuba saved lives, Cuba saved lives, and the same hashtag from the Cuban embassy in Spain. Let's see.
Como escuchábamos ahí la voz de una cubana, bello, ¿verdad? Les recomiendo la lectura.
Summarizing the reading of this article entitled Cuba's Lineage of Cubanhood, written by Juan Morales and posted at the website of Juventud Rebel, the daily newspaper, on March 30th. And some of the paragraphs reads, the old lady Ernestina is popular among her relatives and her neighbors for the nobility with which she usually accompanies each of her actions. I'm going to give you a little coffee. She offers to an exhaustive fumigator. Do you want to drink some cold water? He asks a sweaty passerby. She doesn't need to know them to proceed that way. In her 80s and still giving life, she appropriated the biblical adage, do unto others as you would like do unto you. These kinds of corporations are not demonstration, not going to do rarities in Cuba. Here we have turned solidarity into the credential that identifies us. For us, that word has a wider semantic field than the conferred by the dictionary. And when we allude to her kindness, we do not do it for a material perspective because we think that in its spirituality, here where real philanthropy lies. That is what it is, precisely, to shield ourselves with collective attitudes against the virus threat and to assist with our experience other countries that also suffer from the virus. Lethal effects. The Cuban internationalist calling is marshaled in these cases. We will never do like the ostrich, which hides their heads under the sand not to see what is happening around. For decades, tens of thousands of compatriots have manifested their solidarity in places like the Sahara Desert, the mountains of Pakistan, the jungles of Central America, the hills of Caracas, freezing from the cold or sweating profusely, running the risk of contracting an illness pending on them as a Damocles sword, missing their families and their homeland, inserted in different cultural backgrounds. The Cuban medical internationalists have left for distant places to combat the COVID-19 confirm that Cuba doesn't just look inside because Martí taught us that homeland is humanity. While they are putting the nobility of the indomitable island in another place, here are people like Ernestina helping her neighbors and erecting a humble monument to solidarity every day. Let's do a brief map of the medical international missions Cuba has undertaken around the world. Cuban medical missions, Solidarity Without Borders. In 1960, Cuba offered its medical aid with a shipment to Chile of a brigade to care for the victims of an earthquake. At the end of 1962, during the opening of the Victoria de Girón Medical School for Basic and Preclinical Sciences, Fidel Castro announced the decision to internationalize healthcare aid. In October 1963, the first Cuban brigade arrived in Algeria. It was made up of 58 health specialists. This is considered the formal start of Cuban medical cooperation. More than 400,000 Cuban health professionals have rendered service in 164 countries. About 1.9 billion patients have been cared for and 350 million surgeries have been done. About 30,000 internationalists are currently serving in 66 nations, according to figures offered by the Minister of Public Health, José Ángel Portal Miranda, in May 2019 in the context of the 72nd World Health Assembly held in Geneva, Switzerland. Voluntary work, altruism, humanism, and internationalism are the principles that govern this noble work. José Martí said, the Cuban national hero, help the needy ones, is not only a part of our duty, but also of our happiness. The priorities of Cuban medical cooperation are as follows: provide clinical surgical medical assistance, prioritize remote and hard-to-reach places, develop health education campaigns, prevention education first and foremost, mass vaccination, hygienic and epidemiological control, and attend to all kinds of victims of natural disasters or special contingencies. Cuba has offered assistance around the world regardless of distances, whether conditions, natural disaster, or even ideological or political differences. It has been a key objective for the Cuban Revolution to help the least developed countries condemned to poverty and the most unprotected by the global capitalist system. Thus, the Army of White Coats has covered all of South America, Central America, most of the Caribbean islands, including St. Kitts and Nevis, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Antigua and Barbuda, St. Lucia, Trinidad and Tobago, Jamaica, and French overseas territories like Martinique, Guadeloupe, Guyana, and St. Pierre and Miquelon. In North America, Mexico, and the United States. In Africa, with emphasis in the southern continent and North Africa, from Angola to Zimbabwe. In the Middle East, Algeria, Qatar, Yemen, and Iraq. In the Far East, Laos, Timor-Leste, and other countries in the Pacific. In Europe, it has covered South, North, Central, and East Western Europe. Currently, with the COVID-19 pandemic, Cuba sent support to Italy, Spain, and France. And we'll go to Cuba in our imagination for the moment. We're going with Nayana Tado. How is the situation inside and outside of Cuba? Hello, pleasure greeting you. Indeed, many analysts consider here that the COVID-19 pandemic has shown the fragility of many countries, while Cuba reinforces its health system with solidarity as the main premise and guarantee to life above anything capitalist. In the midst of pressures exerted by the U.S. government as a consequence of the U.S. commercial trade blockade affecting sectors, especially healthcare, the Cuban government guarantees free medical attention for all the people. A recent example of what the U.S. blockade causes is the prohibition to enter a medical donation sent by the Alibaba company with supplies like masks and rapid tests. Their arrival has been prevented due to the American sanctions. In the midst of this situation, Cuba is reinforcing its measures to curb the spread of the virus in the country and offer support to other countries of the world. The Cuban Health Minister, José Ángel Portal, recently said that over 50 years, 450,000 Cuban healthcare professionals from different generations have rendered services and have attended to over 7 million people around the world. And today, over 40 countries have requested assistance for Cuban medical doctors to face this virus. And some 596 specialists have left for 14 countries affected by this pandemic. For the first time, the Henry Reeve Brigade arrived in Europe, and they are already serving in the Lombardia region in Italy, one of the most affected by this pandemic. I have to say that this is taking place in the midst of a campaign which is intended to discredit the Cuban cooperation workers who leave behind their families to provide support to other people around the world. Cuba is also strengthening its health system, reinforcing primary care through an intense screening process, using medical doctors going door to door to detect new cases of the COVID-19. This primary care system has set precedents in the international system. Cuba has over 100,000 doctors, a figure that accounts for 9 specialists for every 1,000 specialists, as said by the Minister of Health, and family attention care that has allowed the country to have a doctor in each community. The development of biotech is also one of the aspects that the Caribbean island is implementing, with treatments that help combat this disease and others inside and outside Cuba. And this has been proven by interferon alpha 2b, which has had successful results in the treatment of patients in China and has been requested to Cuba by over 45 countries affected. Thank you, Nayara Tardo, from Havana. So we're going to our first break in our critical play. And as always, you can become an analyst through participating in our strategic move. Let's see. While neoliberal countries put their economies above their people's, progressive nations prioritize the combat of coronavirus inside and outside their territory. What does solidarity teach us in times of pandemic? Let's go to a break and we'll come back.
Hoy descargamos
130 cubic meters of supplies, including a million masks for healthcare professionals. This is very important to combat stress. 200,000 tests were conducted. This is a very significant logistical effort. The intensity of this pandemic demands an intensive use of equipment. Therefore, we very quickly run out of inventories. Through Ambassador Li Baron and the diplomats from the People's Republic of China, we wish to extend the thanks of President Nicolas Maduro and the Venezuelan people to President Xi Jinping and the people of this sisterly nation for this significant humanitarian assistance arriving today in our country. 55 tons of surgical equipment, supplies, medicines have arrived here. People must know that. The next stage, which will be announced within the next few hours by President Nicolas Maduro. We have arrived 500,000 kits of rapid tests. The first rapid test kits for our offensive, for our next phase, focusing on COVID-19 control and prevention. They are researchers, university professors, and physicians who have been in the front lines from day one. Therefore, the exchanging of experience is very important to combat the coronavirus. We are paying special attention to research to overcome this very aggressive virus as soon as possible. There has been some relief in these very stressful and difficult days. We were in great need of these masks. We needed those ventilators, which the Red Cross will give the government. There you have it. Solidarity in different angles. In the midst of this crisis caused by the spread of the COVID-19 pandemic, countries like Cuba, Venezuela, Russia, and China have offered assistance to several nations around the world. Let's see. China leads today the list of nations practicing solidarity by sending shipments to the rest of the world of medical supplies and trained personnel to combat COVID-19. Its active participation in international cooperation through the donation of $20 million to the World Health Organization, as well as the delivery to France, Spain, Italy, Cuba, Venezuela, and the United States, of masks, protective personal gear, and medical gloves. Russia responded to Italy's call for assistance and shipped 14 Il-76 military aircraft, transporting several brigades with 100 military specialists in virology and epidemiology, as well as transport and land disinfection systems and medical equipment. Moscow's effort to interact with other countries to stop the pandemic this week came to New York, a plane with medical and protective equipment. Humanitarian aid was delivered to New York health workers. Cuba has also shown excellent displays of solidarity. More than a dozen of nations have requested the help of a Cuban healthcare specialist, and today they are found providing care in Italy, Andorra, and various other countries in Central America and the Caribbean. Also, the medical brigades in those countries where they were already operational have been reinforced, as in the case of Venezuela. But while the Caribbean island is offering its help to the international community to combat the coronavirus outbreak, the U.S. State Department urges countries to reject this noble contribution. Amid the coercive measures applied by the White House, Venezuela is strengthening its cooperation with allied countries with the United Nations system to stop the spread of the pandemic. Along these lines, Venezuela has provided solidarity to support neighbors nations. A case in point is President Nicolas Maduro's recent offer to send Colombian authorities equipment to detect the virus. President Ivan Duque, declared enemy of the Bolivarian Revolution, accepted the offer, clarifying that it should be channeled through the Pan American Health Organization. So there's the background that allows us to get into the analysis. From Havana, we have Santiago Perez, Assistant Director of the Research Center for International Policy, and from Spain, Carlos Martinez, International Analyst, BA in Law, and collaborator with different international media outlets. Both of you, welcome. I will start in Cuba, taking into account this background we just saw. Santiago, in the midst of all of this, hearing in some of the statements, this disinformation campaign to discredit the Cuban medical personnel. Why? Why so? Why this discredit campaign? What is the end? What is the ultimate goal of those who are devised this anti-Cuba campaign in the healthcare ambit? Hello, Ray. Greetings to you and the Telesur viewers. I believe, Ray, that this is part of the policy of this administration to isolate Cuba, which they started by reinforcing the blockade in every aspect, in the fuel, in the area of travel, and also in the area of medical export. And this is a very strong campaign that they have been conducting over the last 3 to 4 years, and apparently they were successful in the case of Brazil, as well as in the case of Bolivia and Ecuador, which is part, as I said, of a larger strategy against Cuba. But I believe, Ray, that the level of hostility, the current level of hostility, gives you it's a desperate measure in the face of the falsehood of this campaign and the precepts of this campaign. And secondly, Cuba is gaining international prestige, a greater international prestige under the present circumstances, with the assistance given to the British cruise ship and with the UK foreign minister thanking Cuba and also with Cuba's assistance to Italy, and these are two NATO countries, and with the world public opinion in favor of selfless cooperation that Cuba is giving. And this is not the case. A case in point, we are talking about almost 500,000 Cuban doctors who have paid service around the world, and I think that they're using this hostility against Cuba on this aspect because they have been overtaken by history. What is happening with COVID-19 is what's going to leave indelible marks in the world consciousness. the issue of solidarity, the issue of multilateralism and cooperation. They are going to have, when we overcome this epidemic, is going to have a new presence in the international agenda. So the example of Cuba is going to be very important. That beyond what Cuba can do with its limited resources, but this is a very effective assistance. We're talking about physicians, because due to the neoliberalism waves affecting Europe and Latin America, they don't have doctors to take care of the ill. Their hospital facilities are overcrowded, and then come the Cuban medical brigades with their know-how and their expertise. In addition to the U.S. obsessive campaign against Cuba, there's a wider component of the poor people of defending the narrow interests and the Cubans and others giving assistance because of money. I think that they have been overtaken by history, also by the international public opinion and by their own domestic public opinion. Let me refer to that. Let me introduce Carlos Martinez, who is also in Spain. Carlos, when we speak about governments, non-progressive governments, we cannot put them in the same bag, because we have those, on one hand, those who are more reluctant, which are the ones undertaking this campaign against Cuban specialists, healthcare specialists. However, there are others whose economic base is capitalist, but they accept solidarity not only from Cuba, but from other nations. From Spain, how do you see that? Hello, good afternoon. Along these lines, what you were saying, it's funny how Italy and the government in Lombardy, which is not a left-leaning government, has requested assistance from Cuba, and the same way as Andorra has requested assistance to Cuba, and Spain, a progressive government formed by PSOE and Unidas Podemos, they don't request assistance to Cuba because it could be doubtful that Cuban doctors could come to Spain, and they would this government would be associated to the Cuban government. And on the other hand, in autonomous communities like the one I live in, they requested assistance to Cuba. At this point, it's very important to focus, and I think the most important thing is to save life. And I'm shocked by the cowardice of the Spanish government for the campaign of the U.S. embassy in Cuba to denigrate the Cuban health brigade. This is very easy. If you don't want to know anything about Cuba, Russia, and China, well, you die. You die. Because there is an issue of lack of healthcare physicians. And many physicians left for Northern Europe. And another problem is that only China can make enough medical equipment in order to supply the world. And on the other side, we have the discredit campaign against China. But the truth is that the truth triumphs over these ideologies. Today, the only countries which are doing something for the rest of the world are Cuba, Russia, and China, and to some extent other smaller countries. This is the reality. And against this reality are capitalist governments and reactionary governments. And here is the fake news, and there is so much mentioned fake news, but the fake news are the ones generated to hide their own deficiencies. Santiago, I'm going to use the Carlos' latest words to ask you another question. Today, as Carlos said, the only governments who are doing something not only for their peoples but for the rest of mankind are governments that coincidentally, quote unquote, you will correct me if I'm wrong, are subject to sanctions or political bullying on the part of powers like the United States. Let me ask you, is it just a coincidence? No, it's clear, Ray, that the axis of good is being established by paraphrasing some of the terms by former American presidents when they were saying the axis of evil. I think that cooperation modality, that the multilateralism, that and the example given by Russia and Cuba and China is an element that, as I said, is going to influence the international relations, uh, especially due to the projection of those large powers. Of course, the U.S. have lost the role that they self-proclaim at some point. The crisis of Ebola, the fight against Ebola, and the leaders of rescuing mankind from pandemics. And in all honesty, the Obama administration had some positive positions. But here, it's clear that the United States morally is no leader of anything. The U.S. is no moral really because its system has shown enormous deficiencies. Because if its political class came in late to the development of the pandemic, because its health system has shown all the problems it has, and in addition, because it has been conducting America First policy, and it means that the U.S. come first in terms of the world epidemic, because they have not provided any cooperation. They even closed their doors to the Europeans without alerting them first. They have wanted to steal the vaccines from Germany, and over the last few days they have to change because it was too much. So I believe that in the first place, these are efforts to avoid the projecting leadership of the United States. And they are doing it against large powers like China, which is an economic power, Russia, that militarily is a great power, and Cuba, which is a moral world power. And sometimes moral is not taken into account in international relations. The role of morality, the role of generosity, and selflessness, and to put forward ideas in international relations. And I believe that to a large extent, this has to do with the reaction, such negative reaction that the U.S. had in the face of these countries that are setting moral standards and in terms of multilateralism in international relations. Yeah, this is not, it's not coincidental. Last, Carlos, just to close with this segment of the show, we'll see how in the ideology, some countries they don't, it's not incorporated to be so in solidarity with others. And the example that you cited, that is so close to you, what prevents these other countries, not progressive countries, but that they have assistance by other nations, what prevents them from accepting it? Especially truth, materialism, it is what prevents them from accepting the assistance. Is that the Russian, the Chinese, Cuban model is not as wrong as they thought. That unilateralism, military and ideological unilateralism, because there are other countries that offers ways of cooperating. Of course, and especially in Spain, from Madrid, we had Cuban doctors going to Andorra, stopping over in Madrid, and in vis-a-vis Trump and Merkel and Holland, they're showing solidarity to Spain. And they said solidarity is not giving what is in excess, what you have in excess, but sharing what you have. And that has been very significant in Spain, because in partners like Germany have been teaching a lesson of prohibiting materials to Spain. And as coronavirus has blown up the imperialist system, it is just a small virus, has blown up the whole system. This system, that's why they do not want to recognize the reality. They don't want to accept reality. because accepting China's, Russia, or Cuba's assistance is accepting that the other side was right, that things were done better, and especially that those are systems that, despite being depicted as the evil guys, they have better moral values, ethical values than the values in the United States, and that's very hard to understand. It's difficult to change that chip, and those people who are left supporters, and this is a historical moment, a truly historical moment, because of the psychological shock, because they found that the NATO, the United States, the European Union do not protect us. Uh, what the Spanish and Italian people is that they are waiting for solidarity from countries that were historical enemies. Thank you so much, Santiago. Thank you for your time in Critical Move. Until next time, let's go to a break. Remember, you can participate in a strategic move. It'll be on our screen. Then this is our question on Twitter. You can read it on the screen. While neoliberal countries place their economies on top of their peoples, progressive nations prioritize the combat against COVID-19 inside the borders, but outside as well. What does international solidarity teach us in times of pandemic? Let's go to a break, and when I come back, I will continue to reflect on this issue with our guests in studio.
Al decir de expertos, la crisis derivada de la COVID-19
The COVID-19 crisis is shaping up two forms of state behavior. Cooperation, multilateralism, and solidarity are effective actions to face the pandemic vis-a-vis other governments prioritizing their economies and placing their peoples in the secondary position. The response to the COVID-19 by the so-called capitalist powers has shown their true priorities in terms of health, the state, and the economy. Neoliberal governments are falling apart with the collapse of their public health systems, their slow responses to prevent the spread of the virus. A situation that has spiked the number of infected cases and deaths in countries like the United States, Spain, Italy, France, Ecuador, Brazil, and Chile. With their policies focused on the privatization of resources and state decentralization, these countries have prioritized saving the economy and avoiding an economic collapse instead of human health. United Kingdom imposed a mandatory quarantine a month after the first coronavirus outbreak has been declared in the country, after a number of deaths surpassed 100 and the infected cases were more than 6,000. Public health services and morgues in the state of New York have been overflowed, and the measures taken by the governor, despite being much more reliable than those taken by President Trump himself, have not been sufficient. The number of cases rose to more than 93,000. The United States is the epicenter of the pandemic, with New York having almost half of the cases. On the other hand, the position taken by the Brazilian president, Jair Bolsonaro, has generated strong controversy. His inaction before COVID-19 has caused people's discontent in the country, with the most cases reported in Latin America, with more than 8,000 infected. Experts agree that this crisis will accelerate the process of creating a new multipolar world where nothing will be the same. The epidemic has demonstrated that American global leadership is part of the past, and neoliberal globalism has failed. It is worth highlighting the case of Ecuador, whose critical situation regarding the pandemic, especially in Guayaquil, shows the incapability of Lenin Moreno's government. In this context, while great powers like the United States and the European Union have closed their borders, others such as China and Russia are mobilizing to counter the virus by helping other nations. And in that geopolitical context, let me speak with Gabriel Aguirre, politologist, expert in international relations, Secretary General of the Committee for International Solidarity and Fight for Peace in Venezuela. Gabriel, long title, but how are you? Thank you. Well, we are looking at the way solidarity is prevailing over a narrow interest by neoliberal governments. It's practically what is winning the battle against the COVID-19 pandemic. How do you see that? Yes, the first thing we have to say is that this crisis by the pandemic has revealed the true face of capitalism worldwide. It has shown its true colors, and we have moved from appearance to reality of the capitalist system, which prioritizes individual over the collective, and they work on the basis of individual vanity, and the system works as the same way it acted in the crisis in 2008, saving the economies above human lives. And these are the more powerful economies. Exactly, these are the imperialist countries which have been making statements aimed at how to resolve the economy, how to rescue the large companies, and their interventions and statements. They don't speak about the situation of workers. Just look at the speeches by Donald Trump and you can deconstruct it piece by piece, and you can see how he always talks about how to save companies. When the first appearance by Donald Trump, when the COVID-19 arises, he said, you have a good news and bad news. The good news is that we have been able to replenish our oil strategic reserves, and the bad news is that we're going to have a pandemic that is going to affect, and it's going to affect the whole country. That's in the second place, and that denotes, and it takes second place to saving the economy. So it's time for the mankind and the people. They have never seen the true face of capitalism as an oppressive system, as an individualistic system, a system that prioritizes profit, the profitability of companies above the interest of human life and existence. If we analyze, for example, and we compare the health systems of these countries vis-a-vis the health countries from countries which have been traditionally blockaded by the United States, how can we see that in light of the COVID-19 pandemic? We just have to look at how the different health and other systems in the capitalism, where all of them are privatized. All of these services are privatized. Healthcare is privatized. We have seen that with the numbers about the test, but the COVID-19 test, and countries like Ecuador, a test costs $120, and other countries where there's a different vision as to how to cope with this problem and face this problem. It's possible to provide this test free of charge. Then we enter a contradiction, because one sometimes hears people saying on the street that the private is synonym of quality and effectiveness. Well, but when we look at the numbers, that is not the case. We have seen how these health systems in Europe have been overflowed. They have collapsed. The lack of solidarity of the European Union towards its members like Italy and Spain. But we also have to remember the image of President of Serbia vis-a-vis the inaction of the European against this phenomenon. So the European Union, instead of deploying around the world, I thought that was the problem of China, and consequently no one moved a finger. Now, and that formed part of a campaign, a slander campaign conducted by the United States by calling it the Chinese or the Wuhan virus. We all know that's part of the US script to try to take political advantage of all of this. But accusing China is the best formula the U.S. has to try to get away scot-free from this situation. But we have to see what comes after the pandemic, after the COVID-19 pandemic, how the economies are going to rearrange. We have to see which countries will come out with their more strengthened leadership. Life will not be the same, as people say, after COVID-19. And I want to ask you to look far ahead, and how would you see the world post-COVID-19? Without a doubt, it would seem that China, with that of this situation, will consolidate as the first economic, political, and military power in the world. Even its capacity for influence around the world will be much greater. And the deployment of China in the European Union, in Latin America, with solidarity and support, because of basically all Chinese actions have been based on altruism without any kind of political retribution. China has offered support and solidarity tangible to these countries, the same way as Russia. We have seen military equipment with virologists, military virologists, and in Bergamo, in Italy, supporting this population. And it is a deployment by Russia and China, and also the landing of the Antonov mega plane at the JFK airport. Yeah, it's a war symbolism. Only on the basis of solidarity will it be possible to overcome this crisis together. We all know that the crisis must have a development. At some point in time, we have to overcome it, but only on the basis of solidarity we can do that. What will happen after? The first thing I say is that the people of the world will have to recognize what the capitalist system means, and what we have to be the ones who bury the capitalist system, because it has shown its inviability, and this crisis has evidenced the limits of capitalism. Look, a case in point is what and how the system works in vis-a-vis this situation is the statements by the top echelon of NATO in the European Union. The first thing they said in Italy and Spain, they told them do not think of using the military budget to resolve the COVID-19 crisis. So we have to see where the interests lie. And it shows the warmongering character of NATO. Nothing about solidarity. And the mobilization of troops, of U.S. troops to Europe, is part of the process of consolidation of the military wing, the militaristic wing of the U.S. and the NATO that threaten the people. And also we have this announced deployment by President Trump of U.S. troops in the Caribbean Sea, very near Venezuela. We have seen that U.S. actions in the context of these sudden situations are provocation actions. What they did a few days ago, accusing top Venezuelan officials, even the president, linking them with illicit crimes. These are very dangerous provocation actions, very dangerous provocative actions that can generate chaos in the continent, which they're seeking to take advantage of situations and circumstances to further weaken the liberation processes in the continent, in Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. These are processes that are able to stand up to capitalism and their interest. And on this basis, to try to deal a heavy blow to these countries. But what they do not know is that our peoples have a high degree of consciousness, of anti-imperialist consciousness, and they understand that we have to go through the process of liberation of our people. Thank you so much, Gabriel. Thank you for your approach. And in the midst, and thank you for coming in the midst of all these measures of social isolation, strict protective measures. You're part of the people, but also protecting yourself. You came with your mask and your gloves. That's how he came to our channel, and now he's talking to our viewers. Thank you so much. We'll go to our conclusions. Individualism versus cooperation. Unilateralism versus multilateralism. Selfishness versus solidarity. Coronavirus doesn't distinguish among its victims. Internationalism doesn't make any distinctions among those in need. So we can see in these times of pandemic how the so-called axis of evil, as one of our guests said, has become the axis of good. About the rest is the least important. For today, we are closing our geopolitical board.